Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode. If you could hide to Kolob podcast. My name's Daniel. This is my brother Clive.
Hello and welcome, Daniel. It's a rarity, but we're starting off on a positive, I think. At the beginning, there was a lot of positives, and now this really starts out really well. And as we go on, goes downhill quite quickly, but it's good to start off on a positive note.
There is a few highs and lows in the episode, but yeah, it definitely starts off really, really strong. I might just kick us off with a quote, Clive. This one's nice and simple from Neil A. Maxwell. And he says, "The acceptance of the reality that we are in the Lord's loving hands is only a recognition that we have never really been in." Okay, so let's look at that. I just actually, Clive, I've got well, I feel like over the last month or so, I've had a bit of an obsession with pointing out times in the scriptures where it gives us geographical locations. And
I think we've noticed, yeah.
You've known. So, and this is the same. I was actually just doing a little bit of reading, going over 23, and I started looking at verses 28 of 22, which is last week's episode. And there's a whole bunch of commentary here around where the Lamanites were. And I just found it super interesting. Thought it's something I'd mentioned that in verse 28 of chapter 22, they were spread. This is a description of where the Lamanites lived. They were spread through the wilderness on the west in the land of Nephi, and also on the west of the land of Alma, in the borders by the seashore, and on the west of the land of Nephi. It talks about that they were also, many of them, on the east of the seashore as well. So they're on the west and on the east. And they were at the head of the river Sidon, which is north, from the east to the west, round about the wilderness on the north, even until they came to the land which they called Bountiful, which also borders the land Desolation. This is really interesting, right? Because let's just talk about Bountiful very quick. This is the first time we actually read that there's a place called Bountiful. Bountiful is the only other time we have anything called Bountiful is obviously when Lehi and Co are leaving Jerusalem and they name the place Bountiful. And now in the text, we get zoomed into, there's another place called Bountiful. And it's really interesting that how spread the Lamanites were. Like, they really were a roaming, wandering people. Like, the Nephites kind of keep themselves in this central location that is called Zarahemla. And we know Zarahemla is a land made up of many smaller cities. And there's the capital, let's call it, called Zarahemla. But there's loads of other cities that make up the total location called Zarahemla. And then the Lamanites are kind of spread throughout, and they've really wandered and roamed and opened up other parts of the land which previously weren't done by the Nephites. And I just found that really interesting that, the Lamanites do lots of wandering, and they are kind of always spreading and pushing themselves around. And it just goes to show what we've talked about a bunch of times, just how many people there must have been in this continent.
It's funny you mentioned actually, because I was thinking the other day about how far the Lamanites might have spread obviously they don't have the records. Later on, we read a lot more about the Lamanites when they turn good, but yeah, they don't have records to say, well, we went here and we went here. And I did always wonder how far they went until eventually we'll learn later Moroni goes really, really far. And I wonder how far they spread just by themselves. Yeah, and I guess it just shows the difference between the settlement of the Nephites versus the wanderers of the Lamanites. And I was just thinking when you were just talking just then, it's going to be hard for people in their cars or in their houses to imagine where these cities are. So if we take the land of Zarahemla as a center point, in what direction are we looking at the moment? Like, let's take King Lamoni, for example. What direction is he?
He's south. So if we think about, let's just imagine a rectangle. And so the land of Zarahemla is the middle of the rectangle. And in the middle of the rectangle is the river Sidon or Sidon. Did we decide that it was called Sidon or Sidon?
We looked it up, and I'll just double check again. It is, in fact, Sidon.
So the river Sidon is in the middle of the rectangle, which the middle of the rectangle is the land of Zarahemla, and in the middle of that is the river Sidon. So the land of Nephi is the southern point of the rectangle. And that's where we see the waters of Mormon, Medoni, Shimlon, the land of Nephi, the land of Ishmael. If we look at the top of the rectangle, we see that's where bountiful is. So here in this verse, even until, so this is in the bottom of verse 29 in chapter 20. At the head of the river Sidon, so at the top of this rectangle I've described, from the east to the west, round about on the wilderness, on the north, even until they came to the land. That was directly north of the river Sidon, so on the top of this rectangle. And so that's where we're sort of seeing where these places are. But the land of Nephi, Ishmael, Mormon, that's south. So when the Nephites left with Jacob, of course, when they left and they started warring with the Lamanite, Lehi dies. So Nephi and co quickly get out of Dodge. They travel kind of out, and then they progress further and further and further until we end up living in the land of Zarahemla, which is, I guess, in this middle of this rectangle that I'm poorly describing.
Well, all right, so we'll get into chapter 23 then.
I won't talk about maps for another 2 episodes.
So we're talking about here, we've just spoken about the conversion of King Lamoni, and then his father, it doesn't mention him by name, but he's the king of the land of Nephi. So I guess he's more like the head king. People seem to follow him a lot more.
Yeah.
So he's fully converted to the gospel. You know, he's had these amazing things happen to him that we spoke about last week. And now he sends a proclamation throughout all the land that no one were to lay their hands on the sons of Messiah or those that were with them. And so that the Lord's work would have no obstruction, is how he describes it.
Yeah, I love that. And I've wrote down in my scriptures, I've written down here that it's legislation. We get the church or the parishioners, in this case it's Ammon, Aaron, Omna, and Himni. They get some legal protection because we know of how, or certainly the Lamanites are described as being super barbaric, bloodthirsty, really just super, super average people. And so the king of the Lamanites changes the law to offer protection as they're sort of moving through the Lamanite land, which is the land of Nephi, oddly enough, but it's where all the Lamanites live. And yeah, they're not allowed to. It says that they it's funny because here it actually tells us what the laws are, which we don't often get in the Book of Mormon, but verse 2, that is the law. Yea, he sent a decree among them that they should not lay their hands on them to bind them or to cast them into prison, neither spit on them. You can't smite them. You can't cast them out of your synagogues. You can't scourge them. You can't throw stones at them, but that they should have free access to their houses and also their temples and their sanctuaries. Verse 3 is, well, if we change the law and verse 2 is the law, I'm imagining verse 2 is pretty close to the proclamation that actually got sent out. Well, what's it actually going to do? Well, it's going to help them go forth and preach the word, which is great. And it's also that it's going to give the Lamanites an ability to listen to the words of these missionaries. I like this terminology, Clive, down the bottom of verse 3. I've just got a few words highlighted here, but it says here that the word of God might have no obstructions. So this is the point of the legislative change, but that it might go forth throughout all the land, that his people might be convinced concerning the wicked traditions of the fathers, that they might be convinced that they were all brethren. The wording I like is where it says that they might be convinced concerning. So it's like, he's not putting out legislation to say, you have to be a member of the church or else. He's saying these people need to go free. And because you've got to let them go free, you get a choice to be convinced by them. And I hope. So it's like still giving the people the free agency to listen or not, but they're not allowed to harass them in the process if they choose not to.
Yeah, it's really not a, you must listen, you must obey. It's really I had this choice, you have this choice. The word of God is more of a choice. Let's let the people go and preach the gospel. And it's something that we, believe in today. We believe that every religion should have the opportunity to preach what they need to preach. We don't say, you know what, if we had it our way, only missionaries would go out and preach. Forget the Jehovah's Witnesses and forget everyone else. but
Right.
we believe that everyone should have that opportunity.
Totally. I mean, Joseph Smith there's lots of stories in Kirtland where he welcomes other people of other religions and wants to talk with them and regularly wants to set up regular kind of councils with other religions. It's something that, and even that happens now in wards, there's usually a person called, like a community person called in the wards and at the stake level that works with other religions and they chat and for the good of the community.
Because of this proclamation, they were able to go and preach without obstruction.
Yeah.
And they did so, and they established churches. They had people called into the churches. It says that thousands were converted to the gospel. Again, we've got another load of people converted to the gospel because of these missionaries.
Yeah. Oh, they're unreal. And this is the fruits of their labor, which we'll talk about in a few chapters later on. But the result is thousands were baptized, and thanks to the proclamation change, the legislative change, they could build churches. And that as all these people are becoming, signed, sealed converts to the gospel, they need churches to go to. They need temples to go to. You can't just bring thousands to the church because they go, well, where do we go? So along with that, you've got to then set up this support structure that, okay, well, you've signed up to a church, you signed up to our religion. That's amazing. You can meet at this place, and this person is the priest, and he's the one that's going to teach you, which happens, even like you said before, happens right now. Certainly in the Western world, wherever you move, you and I have moved around plenty of times. When you move, you go, oh, where's the ward? Where's the closest ward? And the church has to set up that support structure for us to be able to worship and go on Sunday and, partake of the sacrament. And that's exactly what had to happen here.
Yeah, exactly. You can just see, I guess, with all these stories, why it took them 14 years. They didn't rush this. They were able to establish these things and have these things built up. I really like here that at the end of verse 5, that it says, thousands were brought to believe in the traditions of the Nephites, and they were taught the records and prophecies which were handed down even to the present time. So they've been given the scriptures now. Okay, here's the scriptures. Here's what our fathers did. I don't think they went, you guys were wrong, but they went, here's the scriptures, here's the doctrine, and they were converted through it and truly understood, well, this is the way that it's, our traditions are our traditions, but they've obviously been messed up at some stage. Now this is the correct way to go. Nephi was right. Nephi was the holy one. We shouldn't have followed Laman and Lemuel. That's how I read it anyway.
Yeah, no, I 100% agree. And I imagine in this next part here in the bottom of verse 6, and it might seem to people listening, we're going through all of these verses, but this chapter 23 is it's seriously so monumental in the Book of Mormon history. Chapter 23 is not spoken about enough for me. But so halfway down verse 6, you're right. So Mormon's describing that thousands of people were brought to the gospel and the amazing work that Aaron did. And then down the bottom of verse 6, he says, according to the spirit of revelation and of prophecy, and the power of God was working miracles in them. Yea, I say unto you, as the Lord liveth, as many of the Lamanites as believed in their preaching and were converted unto the Lord, never did fall away. I found this verse really, really interesting. I imagine, right, Mormon is sitting there and he's in a time where every Lamanite is a bad person. The Nephites are being wiped out. There's not many more around. And it's unbelievable what he's writing. It's unbelievable that he's saying the Lamanites, seriously, they were so good. All of them that believed, they were converted and they never fell away. And he's almost writing it going, no one's going to believe me that this has happened. And he's had to put an oath into the verse. And he says, yea, I say unto you, as the Lord liveth. He's giving us an oath that, guys, you might not believe this. Look around what I'm going through. You don't believe this, but I'm telling you this happened. This is monumental.
Yeah, I wonder if he sort of did it like whoever's reading this going to go, oh yeah, but then what happens? And I know the story of the 2000 Stripling Warriors is coming up, so I better just put this in here so people understand that they did stick to it. And these prophecies, there was a true spirit here felt by these people. And there was a full, true conversion. This isn't a, we believe it until times get tough. This is a, we believe it to the fullest.
So, Clive, it gives us a quick summary of what we're about to read about in chapter 24. But essentially, the righteous, they lay down their weapons, which we'll talk about soon. But then it just gives us a little bit of an insight into whereabouts this main conversion came from. So, the land of Ishmael, the land of Middoni. So, this is verses 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. So, yeah, land of Ishmael, land of Middoni. In a momentous occasion, the people who were of the land of Nephi, Shilom, Shenlom, and Shimnilom. Hopefully I've said them right. All of these places are being summarized as these were the epicenters of where the missionaries had the most success in these suburbs, let's just say. And I say the city of Nephi because the last time righteous Nephites were there was, 500 years ago with actual Nephi. There's been no righteous people in this land since then. And so that's why this mission, what Aaron does is just so unbelievable, because I'm imagining that the Lord and angels in heaven are like, oh my goodness, like after all this time of bringing these people out from Jerusalem, like these people in these towns are finally believers. Like, how miraculous. Well done to Aaron and Ammon, of course, all these people who are the Lamanites.
So thousands get converted. And I found it interesting, and I don't really think there's much to say about it, except the fact that the Amalekites weren't converted.
Yeah.
And the Amulonites weren't converted. But one Amalekite was converted.
Yeah.
It's weird that it adds it in there, It's just an interesting point to throw in. There was non-converted save one Amalekite.
And we don't know who that is, right? Should I put that down as another book in the sealed portion?
Yeah, I only could imagine he's done something great to mention him, because if it's just one out of hundreds of thousands, you wouldn't even mention him. You just say, thousands were converted. But the fact that one actually is mentioned, there's got to be something special about them.
And it must have been recorded by Aaron in a scroll or on a tablet for it to make it to 500 years later when the Book of Mormon is being abridged. And as Mormon's reading through the scrolls and he's reading through all of the material, he's obviously found this guy's name. Oh, he's done it. Okay, well, that's obviously special that Aaron's made a note of it. I need to make it. Okay, so the only other thing, Clive, I just wanted to touch on here is a big deal, and that is the renaming of the people. So if we look at verse 17, so we're in chapter 23 if you're just caught up to us. And it came to pass that they called their names Anti-Nephi Lehis, and they were called by this name. They were no more called Lamanites. It's pretty important, like what's in a name. It's pretty important for your name to be right. It's important to be known by the right. And these people have called themselves Anti-Nephi Lehis. In other words, they are like Nephi and Lehi. And that's
Is that what anti means back then? Is that what
yes, like Nephi and Lehi. Yeah. And I got that from some Hugh Nibley stuff I was finding.
Right, okay.
Yeah. So like Nephi and Lehi, not in opposition to Nephi and Lehi as we would read it.
Yeah, as many would have been confused. Yeah. And
yeah.
why would you be anti-Nephi Lehis? Yeah. Okay, so like Nephi and Lehi.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah. And then the chapter ends with just a little bit of an exclamation on what they did. They began to be very industrious people. Yea, they were very friendly with the Nephites. Therefore, they did open a correspondence with them, and the curse of God did no more follow them. So, a couple of things to mention here. I'm wondering, because the like I talked about before, I'm going to talk about the map again. The Nephites are in the land of Zarahemla. Let's just call them landlocked. They don't have access. Of course, they could go to the ocean if they wanted to, but the land of Zarahemla is in the middle. It's not super, super close to the ocean on either side. So if they've opened up trade now with the land of Nephi, which borders the ocean, I wonder what else that would have meant. Does that mean that they could now sell fish to the land of Zarahemla? Does that mean there were other types of vegetation that grew near the ocean that didn't grow in the middle of the continent? It's obviously noteworthy enough to be in here that they were industrious and they began to, correspond. So they began to trade with them and they began to be involved. There must have been some kind of highway established that they would just sort of trot back and forth in whatever it was that they were trading between the two lands. There must have been stuff that grew in the middle in Zarahemla in the jungle that they couldn't get in the ocean, and so therefore trade routes are established.
And don't forget, the Lamanites were everything they did was for their own gain. So they never really became an industrious people, because they would either be wanderers, like we mentioned at the beginning of this podcast, or they would take over someone else's land. So the land of Nephi was a wealthy land. It's been in control of the Lamanites for hundreds of years, and by now definitely would have been a lot falling apart. So they've gone, well, we're an industrious people now. Let's change our mindset. Let's work out how the Nephites did it, and let's build like they built. That's how I see it. So they've gone, okay, we need to organize how they organize. We need to rebuild this city. And they've completely changed, so that they've gone, very other direction. The last thing, Daniel, I wanted to mention was, and it's really short, but it seems so important. And the curse of God did no more follow them. Now, the curse that we're speaking of here is the fact that they weren't allowed the priesthood.
Yes.
They were so against that they weren't allowed the priesthood anymore. Now, it seems such a small bit to now say, and now they're able to have this priesthood again. So is that what we're talking about here? Are they able to have the priesthood again? The anti-Nephi Lehi's, that is, not all the Lamanites.
Yeah, that's right. So these people who had been converted, and there were thousands of them, were now able to receive the covenants. And I don't think it's the priesthood is the start, but I'm imagining that they were able to enter into temple covenants as well. So you're right. There's just a few little, this happens quite a lot throughout the Book of Mormon. There's just one sentence here or one sentence there. But these people who, because of Laman and Lemuel, and Lehi blesses his grandchildren, the children of Laman and Lemuel, says that they won't be judged because of the poor teachings of their fathers. And only now, these hundreds of years later, is that these Laman and Lemuel's descendants are able to, get the priesthood.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, and I mean, it's not just that. Like you said, with the priesthood comes baptisms. They're able to now baptize each other. And like you said, the temple covenants, and organize, the churches that they run, they can be the stewards of them. They can be the bishops and the presidents and people in charge of certain congregations. So, there's so much that's opened up to them now that they have this ability because of the priesthood, because of this repentance process that they've done.
Clive, the only other thing to mention here is the word curse. If we look down at our footnotes, it gives us 3 separate scriptures. And I'm not prepared for this, but maybe I'll find First Nephi, you do Second Nephi, but I'll go to First Nephi. So this is telling us what the word curse refers to. First Nephi 2:23. Yes, First Nephi 2:23. For behold, in that day that they shall rebel against me, I will curse them, even with a sore curse, and they shall have no power over thy seed, except they shall rebel against me also. So that's one description of what the curse is that's being removed or being recognized and moved away from. What about 2 Nephi 36?
Okay, so that says, and then shall they rejoice, for they shall know that it is a blessing unto them from the hand of God, and their scales of darkness shall begin to fall from their eyes, and many generations shall not pass away among them, save there shall be a pure and delightsome people.
So what an amazing blessing that is for them, that spiritual darkness has moved away. And then 3 Nephi 2:15 says, and their curse was taken from them, and their skin became white like unto the Nephites.
So I guess it's now that this curse of no longer having the priesthood has been taken, the mark to symbolize who these people are has also been removed from them. That's the way that they're able to distinguish back then. Well, these are the Lamanites and aren't able to have the priesthood, and these are the Nephites who are. Now that they're able to have this priesthood, that mark has been taken away from them, and they've become like the Nephites. So, Daniel, those who weren't converted, now they've gone away. They don't see the king of the land of Nephi as their king anymore. They've gone completely separate and gone, well, we're going to have our own kingdom. We're going to forget you guys. They've gone quite anti. They decided, well, we're going to go to war with these people. And at this time, the king of the land of Nephi, he dies, and his kingdom is given to his son, who he has named his son Anti-Nephi-Lehi. So, as you're reading this, you might get a bit confused with what's going on, but Anti-Nephi-Lehi is now the king of the land of Nephi, and the people that have changed to Nephi to call themselves Anti-Nephi-Lehis. But now that these people are going to war, there's a huge war that happens. This isn't a simple, like we've talked about in the past. This is such a big war. This is a war where thousands of people die. But because the anti-Nephi-Lehis have decided that we're not going to fight anymore, they've converted so much that they've gone, we're not going to fight with our brothers anymore. These are our brethren, and we know sin, we love the Lord, and we know what the atonement is. And so instead of fighting with our brethren, we will just stand there and pray to our God and try and establish peace that way.
Yeah.
But it didn't go well.
No, and it's funny, I just wanted to touch on this civil war that breaks out, because it seems so extreme, but it actually is a really, really big deal. Like, so we live here in Australia and we've got religious freedom. Now, if our prime minister just brought in he was convinced of a new way of life was better than our way of life, and so brought in these rules that starts practically changing the way we live and the way I believe that we should live. That's upset people, and it's upset these people, the Amalekites and the Ammonites and the Nehorites as well. It's upset all of these people to the point where they say, well, we're not living in a country that's in a country, because that's what they are, right? The king leads their country, and they call the land of Nephi their own country. So we're not a country in a country. We're the land of Nephi. We're Lamanites. We practice Lamanite things. You're not going to bring in a religious king, and he's going to be a religious king over us. You can forget it. Like, we're the Lamanites. This is what we believe in. And so this arms tons of people who take offense to a king becoming a religious leader that they don't believe. And so it breaks out in civil war. Thousands and thousands of people are involved. And yeah, then the church goers simply say, well, we're done with our murderous past. We're not going to go and try to fight them and kill them. We've already done all the murder we can handle. God's already forgiven us for our past murders. We can't do any more. We're not going to partake in this civil war. And if we go, we go.
I might just read 2 verses here. It just sort of sums up everything, but there's still a lot to it. So obviously, you're going to read for yourself. But let me read verse 19 of 24. And thus we see that when these Lamanites were brought to believe and to know the truth, they were firm and would suffer even unto death rather than commit sin. And thus we see that they buried their weapons of peace, or they buried the weapons of war for peace. And then if we go down to 22, and thus without meeting any resistance, they did slay 1,005 of them. This is speaking of the Lamanites against the Anti-Nephi-Lehites. And we know that they are blessed, for they have gone to dwell with their God. So the fact that they weren't, even though this war was upon them, they still believed that they shouldn't fight, and 1,005 of them were killed because of their true conversion.
Well, they believe, they talk about the reason for that is because they say in verse 12, now my best beloved brethren, since God hath taken away our stains and our swords have become bright, then let us stain our swords no more with the blood of our brethren. And they really believe that. They say, we've been forgiven, not going to do this again. And it's pretty extreme, isn't it? Like, to kill 1,000 people who are offering up no resistance, that's pretty graphic.
I agree, and I guess they some of them agreed as well. Like, obviously, something here has happened, and there's something here that must be true, because if we read verse 24, it says, "Now when the Lamanites saw this, they did forbear from slaying them, and there were many whose hearts had swollen in them for those of their brethren, and had fallen under the sword, and they repented of the things which they had done." So obviously they saw what was happening and just decided, well, if they're willing to die for this, obviously something's touched them. And saying that their hearts were swollen, I could just imagine that was sort of like getting teary and going, well, why aren't you fighting back? What are you doing?
Yeah, and
Why aren't you fighting
this
us?
was people they knew. Like these aren't people from another town that's, a 3 days walk away. This is the land of Nephi, and they would have all have known about each other at least. Verse 26, and it came to pass that the people of God were joined that day by more than the number who had been slain. And those who had been slain were righteous people. Therefore, we have no reason to doubt that, but what they were saved. So there's so many people are going up to the anti-Nephi Lehis who say, well, we're not going to fight. So many people are touched by it. Yeah, that more than were killed were converted. So more than 1,000, and what was the number?
2005.
So at least 1,006 joined the church because of this kind of occasion, which is really, really nice, a nice sentiment, but it gets worse. But there's just one thing before we move on to that. It gives, we get a snapshot of who was involved here. So 28 and 29, I'm going to read both. Now, the greatest number of those of the Lamanites who slew so many of their brethren were Amalekites and Ammonites, the greatest number of whom were after the order of Nehors. Now, among those who joined the people of the Lord, there were none who were Amalekites or Ammonites, or who were after the order of Nehor, but they were actual descendants of Laman and Lemuel. I found that really fascinating. So of all these people who joined the church, they were descendants of Laman and Lemuel. Now, what again, these chapters are just unbelievable about history being rewritten, but it's only the descendants of Laman and Lemuel that were converted. So that's amazing, because finally the lineage of Laman and Lemuel is becoming finally, after all these years and all the trials that Laman and Lemuel themselves went through and the angels that they saw and they still weren't converted. And now finally their descendants are converted. But on the flip side, it obviously just shows that Nehor, who was such a strong anti against the gospel, his people, his descendants are still causing an absolute nightmare, along with the Amalekites and Ammonites as well. Big couple of verses there just to give some context about what we're talking about.
And, this next verse, the prophet could say this today and not reference the scriptures, and it would still be true today. And thus we can plainly discern that after a people have been once enlightened by the Spirit of God, and have had great knowledge of the things pertaining to righteousness, and then have fallen away into sin and transgression, they become more hardened, and thus their state becomes worse than though they had never known these things. I mean, how true is that? How true is the people that are against the church the most are people that used to be members of the church. I see that a lot. I saw that a lot as a missionary, and I notice a lot more now understanding that. And it's just a shame that, those people that are true disciples at some stage have turned their backs, and like the Ammonites and the Amalekites, they're just no matter what has happened, no matter how many lives are touched, they're so hardened in their ways and so set never to go back. It's just a crazy situation to me.
Clive, there's so much more to talk about. We've basically been talking for quite a while now, and we've got through 2 chapters. Let's end this as a part 1, and let's come back as part 2, and we'll look at chapter 25 and certainly chapter 26.
Okay, well, thanks for listening to another episode of If You Could Hide Kolob podcast. Make sure you follow us on our social media pages to keep up with the content that we're putting out. You can see all these maps that Daniel keeps talking about. and every episode that we keep bringing out. Thank you.